Have you ever smiled into the eyes of the man destroying 10 years of your career, knowing he just armed a bomb under his own executive chair? Corporate loyalty is a joke, but encrypted contracts never lie. Julian thought he was throwing me out to steal my work. He had no idea the termination button he smugly clicked was the trigger for a $9.4 million financial death sentence. Hello and welcome back to Boss Revenge Stories. Unfortunately, YouTube has recently demonetized our channel, leaving us without the budget to continue operating normally. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us by joining the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel, where you can listen to even better, longer, and more detailed exclusive true stories with multiple emotional voice actors that we cannot publish on YouTube. You can join by scanning the Patreon QR code on your screen or by clicking the link in the description or the pinned comment of this video. Now, let us begin today's story and see how I, Harper Reynolds, executed the ultimate corporate takedown. At exactly 8:30 in the morning, the harsh fluorescent lights of the OmniStream Logistics headquarters felt more oppressive and sterile than usual. I was 34 years old, and until that exact moment, I held the title of Chief System Architect. I had spent the last 10 years pouring my blood, sweat, and brilliant lines of code into building the digital backbone of this entire transportation tech empire. But as my calendar pinged with an unexpected mandatory meeting in Conference Room B, the one with the thick, soundproof frosted glass, I knew exactly what was coming. Inside the suffocating, climate-controlled room sat Julian Vance. Julian was the vice president of operations, a ruthlessly ambitious man whose entire career was built on finance degrees, aggressive cost-cutting, and stealing credit for other people's labor. He knew absolutely nothing about technology or system architecture, yet he carried himself with the unearned arrogance of a Silicon Valley prodigy. Next to him sat a fresh-faced human resources representative I had never seen before, her hands nervously clutching a thick manila folder. "Harper, please take a seat," Julian said, his voice dripping with practiced, completely fabricated empathy. He did not even bother to look up from his digital tablet. "As you know, we are standing on the edge of a massive corporate merger. Leadership has to make some very tough choices to ensure our operational synergy is optimized for the new incoming board of directors." Operational synergy. It was the exact kind of hollow, meaningless corporate buzzword Julian loved to throw around when he was about to ruin someone's livelihood. He continued his long, rehearsed monologue, stringing together sentences about streamlining workflows and eliminating redundant overhead, but I translated his corporate garbage perfectly in my head. He was eliminating my role. More accurately, he was pushing me out onto the street so he could seize total, unchecked control of the proprietary core system I had meticulously built from scratch over the past 10 years. With me gone, he could present my life's work to the new executive board as his own brilliant technological asset, easily securing his spot at the top of the new corporate hierarchy. "Due to this organizational restructuring, your position is being eliminated, effective immediately," Julian finally stated. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair with a faint, self-satisfied smirk playing on his lips, bathing in the glow of his own perceived brilliance. The human resources representative slid the manila folder across the cold, polished oak table. She opened it, pointing a trembling pen at the dotted line on the final page. "This is your standard severance agreement," she recited, clearly reading from a legally approved script. "If you sign this release of claims today, the company is prepared to offer you 2 months of your base salary. However, as a result of your immediate termination, all of your unvested company stock options are hereby revoked and returned to the corporate pool." 2 months, 10 years of my life, the very foundation of their multi-billion-dollar infrastructure, reduced to 60 days of pay and the blatant theft of my equity. Julian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, watching me closely like a predator cornering its prey. He was waiting for the emotional breakdown. He wanted the tears, the desperate pleading, the angry, unprofessional outburst that he could use to justify his cruel decision. He wanted to feel powerful. I did not give him a single drop of satisfaction. Instead of speaking, I kept my face entirely blank, holding a mask of pure, absolute calm. I slowly lowered my eyes to the paperwork in front of me, skimming past the standard legal threats and non-disclosure clauses until my gaze landed precisely where I needed it to be. There, printed neatly in black ink under the official reason for dismissal, was the internal company classification code for my departure. Code 404, Unilateral Termination Without Employee Fault. A cold, quiet thrill washed over me, chilling my veins in the absolute best possible way. Julian was far too busy gloating to realize the catastrophic magnitude of what that specific code meant. He had absolutely no idea what he had just set in motion. I looked up. Meeting Julian's smug, arrogant eyes, I did not reach for the pen. I did not say a single word. I simply gave a slow, deliberate nod, pushed the unsigned severance agreement back across the table, and stood up from my chair. "Wait, you need to sign that right now," the human resources representative stammered, her eyes darting between me and Julian in utter confusion. I ignored her completely. I turned my back on them and walked toward the frosted glass door. The silence in the room was deafening, heavy with Julian's sudden, unspoken confusion as my calm, wordless departure completely shattered his expectations of a dramatic victory. I stepped out of the conference room and walked down the long, sterile corporate hallway for the last time. I could feel Julian's mocking gaze burning into my back through the glass, but I did not care. He thought he had just won the corporate game of a lifetime. He thought he had effortlessly removed the final obstacle standing between him and absolute power. But as I pushed open the heavy front doors and stepped out into the crisp morning air, leaving the OmniStream Logistics building behind me, a brilliant, terrifying chessboard had just been set up in my mind. The game had not ended. It had just officially begun, and Julian Vance had just made the biggest, most expensive mistake of his miserable life. The drive back to my downtown Chicago apartment was remarkably quiet. I did not turn on the radio. I simply let the steady, distant hum of the city wash over me, savoring the absolute clarity of what was about to unfold. Executive management always operates under a fundamental, fatal delusion. Men like the vice president of operations believe that true power is inherently tied to a title on a frosted glass door, or the ability to aggressively manipulate a quarterly earnings report. They see the engineers and system architects as mere mechanics, disposable laborers who exist solely to build the engines that propel their massive executive bonuses. They never realize that the person who designed the labyrinth is the only one who truly knows where the dead ends and the trapdoors are hidden. I unlocked my front door, tossing my keys onto the granite counter. My apartment was a sanctuary of order and quiet logic, a stark contrast to the chaotic political theater I had just left behind. I walked straight to my home office and opened my personal laptop. This machine was heavily fortified with multi-layered encryption protocols, completely isolated from any network tied to my former employer. I bypassed the standard, commercial interfaces and tunneled directly into an independent, decentralized cloud storage vault. This was my private digital archive, a ghost ship floating far beyond the reach and comprehension of any corporate IT administrator. My fingers flew across the keyboard, executing a highly specific search query I had not needed to use in exactly 5 years. A single, lengthy document materialized on the screen. It was the Master Service Level Agreement, a highly classified federal contract I had personally drafted and negotiated with the company's largest and most critical client, the United States Department of Transportation. At the time of signing, the executive board had been so completely blinded by the sheer dollar amount of the federal partnership that they rubber-stamped the technical stipulations without a second glance. They handed the document to their legal team, and the legal team, assuming the dense technical jargon was merely standard operational boilerplate, approved it blindly. Not a single executive ever bothered to read the fine print of the security protocols I had meticulously hard-coded into the legal framework. I scrolled down to page 47, stopping squarely on Clause 8.c, officially titled the Core Personnel Guarantee. The logic behind this specific clause was beautifully, ruthlessly simple. Federal transportation data is a matter of strict national security. The infrastructure I built handled real-time logistics for government supply chains, hazardous material routing, and interstate transit grids. A digital ecosystem of that magnitude requires absolute, unshakable stability. Clause 8.c dictated that the overarching cybersecurity of the system was inextricably linked to its chief architect. Therefore, if the chief architect were to be removed from the project unilaterally, without any documented fault, negligence, or breach of duty, the federal system would automatically classify the sudden absence of its primary caretaker as a severe, immediate vulnerability. It would instantly trigger a critical threat protocol. When dealing with the federal government, a critical threat is not merely a flashing warning light on a supervisor's dashboard. It is a catastrophic breach of trust that requires immediate, punitive financial remediation to secure the compromised data. To mitigate this hypothetical risk, Clause 8.c mandated an automatic, non-negotiable buyout penalty. In the event of an unprovoked termination, precisely $9.4 million would be immediately extracted from the corporate escrow fund and transferred directly to the terminated architect. This was absolutely not a severance package. It was an unconditional security compensation mechanism designed to ensure the ousted architect remained financially bound to confidentiality and to severely penalize the vendor for recklessly endangering federal infrastructure. I picked up my phone and dialed a familiar number. Arthur picked up on the third ring. He was a veteran corporate lawyer, my former mentor, and a man who understood the intricate, dangerous dance between technology and corporate law better than anyone else in the city. "Well, you are calling me before noon on a Tuesday," Arthur said, his gravelly voice crackling warmly through the speaker. "I assume the corporate guillotine finally dropped." "It dropped," I replied smoothly, leaning back in my chair. And the vice president of operations swung the blade himself. "Check your secure inbox. I just sent you the federal service level agreement from 5 years ago. Go straight to Clause 8.c and cross-reference it with the termination code he officially filed." I heard the rhythmic clicking of Arthur's mouse through the line, followed by a long, heavy silence as his seasoned mind absorbed the legal and financial gravity of the documents. Then, a low chuckle rumbled from his chest, quickly escalating into a full, genuine laugh. "My God, Harper," Arthur breathed, the pure amusement evident in his tone. "They actually used Code 404 unilateral termination without employee fault." He wanted to push me out immediately to claim the core system before the upcoming merger. I explained. He bypassed all the standard performance review procedures because he had absolutely no legitimate cause to fire me. Code 404 was the fastest administrative route to get me out of the building this morning. And by taking the fastest route, he legally authenticated the exact trigger condition for a federal security breach penalty, Arthur said, marveling at the sheer, blinding stupidity of the executive class. "This contract is ironclad. The United States Department of Transportation signed off on this. Your former CEO signed off on this. Because this penalty is tied to an active escrow account governing federal data. The transfer protocol bypasses their internal corporate accounting department entirely. It is a fully automated execution." "That is exactly what I thought," I said, a faint, genuine smile touching my lips for the first time that day. "Keep your phone on. Arthur, the weather over there is about to get very rough." "Enjoy the storm," he replied before disconnecting the call. I turned my attention back to my glowing monitor. I opened a hidden terminal window and initiated a passive tracking script. It was a silent, invisible piece of code that would not interfere with the company servers, but would allow me to remotely observe the encrypted data flow between their corporate financial portal and the federal oversight system. Everything was perfectly in place. The unchangeable parameters of the contract were awakening, calculating deep within the server architecture. I stood up, walked over to my living room liquor cabinet, and poured a generous measure of aged bourbon into a heavy crystal glass. I returned to my desk, took a slow, burning sip of the amber liquid, and sat back in the silence of my apartment, comfortably waiting for the digital dominoes to fall. While I was sitting in the quiet, undisturbed comfort of my apartment, a very different and far more chaotic scene was unfolding on the top floor of the OmniStream headquarters. Julian Vance had wasted absolutely no time claiming his unearned victory. According to the internal gossip channels that still fed passively into my encrypted devices, he had popped an absurdly expensive bottle of vintage champagne in his corner office just before noon. He was surrounded by his hand-picked circle of sycophants and junior executives, holding a crystal glass high and toasting to his own manufactured genius. "We just trimmed the fat, gentlemen," Julian boasted to the room, his voice echoing off the modern art hanging on his walls. "Not only did we eliminate a massive payroll liability, but we secured total ownership of the logistics grid just in time for the merger. The new board is going to hand us the keys to the kingdom." He genuinely believed he had executed a masterstroke of corporate strategy. He was completely blind to the reality that the kingdom he was so eager to inherit was already locking its gates from the inside. Deep beneath the physical floors of the building, humming within the chilled, restricted server racks, the core system was already reacting to my forced departure. The federal contract I had drafted did not rely on human intervention, corporate politics, or executive ego. It was a cold, calculating digital organism, and it had just realized its primary caretaker had been abruptly severed from its network. It interfaced directly with the automated payment gateway of our partner bank. Following the precise security protocol hard-coded into its digital DNA, the system quietly initiated a 48-hour countdown. There were no flashing red alerts on Julian's expensive desktop monitors. There were no klaxons echoing through the hallways. True catastrophic system events rarely announce themselves with dramatic, cinematic alarms. They begin in absolute silence, creeping through the wires like a shadow. Julian's newly appointed network administrator, a young, overly confident corporate yes-man who possessed a fraction of the necessary experience, was the first person to brush up against the invisible tripwire. Sitting at his freshly assigned desk, he attempted to override the master administrative controls of the routing matrix to officially transfer ownership to Julian's account. He confidently typed in the standard executive override commands. Access denied. Frowning, he tried forcing a back-end protocol reset to bypass the security wall. Access denied. He needed my specific biometric encryption key to bypass the root firewall, something he was vastly underqualified to understand or replicate. Instead of recognizing this hard lock as a critical security event, the administrator simply rolled his eyes. He assumed it was just a glitchy piece of legacy software left behind by a bitter former employee. "Stupid outdated code," he muttered to himself, closing the terminal window and deciding he would simply deal with the annoyance after the weekend. He chose laziness over diligence, exactly as I knew Julian's cronies would. With the biometric wall standing firm and the unauthorized breach attempt logged, the automated protocol moved to its next logical phase, the massive OmniStream escrow fund, a colossal pool of liquid capital designed specifically to guarantee federal contracts, began to subtly shift states. The digital locks engaged at the institutional banking level. Millions of dollars were silently frozen, quarantined from the general corporate ledger, and prepped for the inevitable, unstoppable transfer to my private trust account. The financial ecosystem generated a mandatory notification regarding this massive liquidity freeze. An automated email was immediately dispatched to the OmniStream accounting department with a subject line detailing a contingency fund status change. A junior accountant, buried under a mountain of merger-related spreadsheets and exhausted by Julian's aggressive deadlines, actually received the message, but because the email originated from a government compliance server, its formatting was dense, bureaucratic, and highly generic. The corporate spam filter, designed to aggressively weed out standard terms of service updates and vendor newsletters, flagged the message based on its metadata. It bypassed the accountant's primary inbox entirely and landed quietly in the junk folder, buried instantly under lunch catering advertisements and automated daily server digests. The final warning was swept away by an algorithm designed to save time. The next morning, the world felt entirely different. I took a slow, deliberate walk to my favorite corner coffee shop, breathing in the crisp air rolling off the lake. I ordered a black coffee, found a quiet table near the front window, and watched the busy city move around me. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and opened the secure tracking application. A single, encrypted push notification appeared at the top of the interface. Activation condition confirmed, commencing 24-hour countdown. The first half of the security protocol had successfully completed in total darkness. I took a slow sip of my coffee, perfectly content in the terrifying silence before the storm. The morning after the 24-hour countdown began, the meticulously organized world of OmniStream logistics shattered. It started precisely at 7:15 in the morning. The chief financial officer, a man whose blood pressure was already stretched to the absolute limit by the impending corporate merger, logged into the master liquidity portal to run his daily financial checks. The numbers staring back at him did not make any logical sense. He refreshed the page. He cleared his browser cache. He completely rebooted his secure terminal, but the horrifying reality remained completely unchanged. Nearly $10 million of the company's critical cash reserve had simply vanished overnight. It was not just a minor rounding error, it was a catastrophic financial hemorrhage that immediately destroyed the strict liquidity requirements legally mandated by the acquiring board of directors. The entire merger was suddenly on life support. Absolute chaos erupted across the executive floor. The chief financial officer bypassed every standard reporting protocol and ordered the entire senior information technology team into the main corporate war room. Dozens of frantic engineers scrambled across keyboards, tracing digital footprints through the corporate ledger, desperate to find an external hacker or a massive systemic glitch. Within 20 minutes, the lead systems engineer found the anomaly. It was not a breach from the outside. It was a perfectly authenticated, internally generated wire transfer currently locked in a state of pending final clearance. The engineer's voice actually trembled as he read the transaction description aloud to the terrified room. It stated, "Execution of Clause 8.c, Core Personnel Security Breach." Julian Vance was violently pulled from a luxury breakfast meeting and shoved into the war room. His usual arrogant swagger evaporated the exact second he saw the pure, unadulterated panic on the faces of the executive team. The chief financial officer pointed a shaking finger at the massive projection screen, demanding an immediate explanation for the missing capital. Julian stared at the pending transfer, his face draining of all color. He slammed his fists onto the conference table and began screaming at the engineering team. "Cancel it," Julian roared, his voice cracking with desperation and fury. "I do not care what that clause says. Terminate that transfer right now and lock the accounts down." The lead engineer typed furiously, attempting to force a manual administrative override. Suddenly, a massive red warning box violently seized the main screen. The engineer backed away from his keyboard as if the plastic keys were on fire. "I cannot touch it," the engineer stammered, holding his hands up. "The transaction is heavily shielded by a federal security protocol. The system is warning us that any unauthorized manual interference will automatically trigger a Level 1 breach alarm directly to the United States Department of Transportation. If I click cancel, the federal government will raid this building by noon." The head of the legal department, sweating profusely and breathing heavily, burst into the room clutching a thick stack of printed documents. He had ordered his clerks to tear through the physical archives to find the origin of this mysterious security clause. He threw the service-level agreement onto the table. Flipping frantically to page 47, the room fell into a deathly, suffocating silence as the executives leaned in to inspect the paper. There, stamped clearly at the bottom of the unread security stipulations from exactly 5 years ago, were 2 fully authenticated electronic signatures. One belonged to the current chief executive officer, the other belonged to Julian Vance. They had blindly signed away nearly $10 million of corporate leverage without ever bothering to read the terms. Julian staggered backward, the reality of his monumental stupidity finally crushing the breath out of his lungs. Driven by pure terror, Julian fled the war room and barricaded himself in his private office. He pulled out his phone and began wildly dialing my number, over and over. The calls went straight to my voicemail. He switched to text messages, his thumbs flying across the screen in a frantic, unhinged blur. He threatened to sue me into oblivion. He threatened to have me arrested for corporate extortion. He promised to ruin my professional reputation so thoroughly that I would never work in the technology sector again. He viciously demanded that I immediately provide the administrative cancellation code to reverse the transaction. Miles away from the suffocating panic of the OmniStream Tower, I was taking a peaceful morning walk through a quiet city park. The sun was shining brightly, reflecting beautifully off the autumn leaves. My phone vibrated endlessly in my coat pocket, a rapid, rhythmic buzzing that felt exactly like a desperate heartbeat. I did not bother to answer a single ring. I simply left the device on silent mode, enjoying the crisp breeze against my face and the sound of the birds. Eventually, the vicious threat stopped. Julian realized that screaming into the void was not going to save his career or the merger. The tone of his messages shifted violently from aggressive extortion to pathetic, groveling desperation. He begged me to pick up the phone. He promised to immediately reinstate my position as chief system architect. He offered to double my base salary, to give me unrestricted executive stock options, to give me absolutely anything I wanted if I would just stop the automated countdown. I stopped walking and finally pulled my phone from my pocket. I read through the pathetic stream of messages with a cold, detached amusement. I opened the keyboard, slowly typing out a single, definitive response to seal his fate. Contracts cannot be renegotiated once automated execution begins. I pressed send, slid the phone back into my pocket, and continued my quiet, peaceful walk through the park. When a cornered animal realizes the trap is closing, it does not surrender gently. It thrashes, it bites, and it makes catastrophic mistakes. Julian Vance was completely out of legitimate options. The internal engineering team was paralyzed by the federal warnings, and the legal department was already drafting defensive memos to save their own careers. Julian knew that if the sun rose and that transfer completed, the merger would die, and the incoming board of directors would personally crucify him. So, under the cover of darkness, he made the most desperate, fatal decision of his entire life. According to the digital audit trail I later reviewed, Julian bypassed the company protocols entirely. He reached into the corporate underworld and hired an external, black market contractor, a shadow hacker willing to do dirty work for a massive, under-the-table cash payout. Julian sneaked this contractor into the executive suites just past midnight. His objective was seemingly straightforward in his panicked mind, since my termination under Code 404 was the trigger. Julian wanted the hacker to retroactively infiltrate the human resources database and falsify my digital exit paperwork. The goal was to spoof my unique biometric signature, plant it on a forged document, and alter the official record to show a voluntary resignation. Julian genuinely believed that if he could just change the origin state of my departure, the automated escrow contract would read the new data, assume a system error had occurred, and quietly abort the pending wire transfer. He thought he was being brilliantly ruthless. He had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 10 years anticipating exactly this kind of executive corruption. When I designed the architecture for the Department of Transportation, I did not just build a defensive wall. I built a heavily armed, autonomous fortress. A biometric key tied directly to a federal logistics grid is not a simple password. It is a legally binding digital identity. The exact second the shadow hacker injected the spoofed biometric hash into the main server, attempting to overwrite a locked federal document, they tripped a massive wire they could not even see. The system did not simply reject the fake code. It immediately identified the brute force biometric forgery as an active hostile cyber attack originating from inside the executive corporate network. Deep within the server logic, the anti-fraud protocol violently woke up. This protocol was an absolute zero-tolerance mechanism. The system recognized that the company infrastructure was currently compromised by a malicious internal actor trying to manipulate federal security parameters. Therefore, the system logically concluded that waiting out the rest of the clearance timer was an unacceptable risk. To protect the threatened federal assets and execute its mandate before the network could be completely hijacked, the core system automatically bypassed the remaining countdown entirely. It authorized an immediate emergency execution of the financial penalty. I was sitting comfortably on my living room sofa, reading a book in the quiet hours of the early morning, when my encrypted private phone vibrated with a completely different, heavy rhythm. I picked it up and opened the secure banking application. A brilliant, undeniable green banner flashed across the screen. The transaction was no longer pending. The transfer was absolute, irrevocable, and complete. Exactly $9.4 million had officially settled into my decentralized trust account, arriving 12 hours earlier than the initial projection. Julian's desperate, illegal attempt to save himself had literally accelerated my payday. Simultaneously, a very different kind of notification was erupting at the OmniStream headquarters. The silent phase of the security protocol was officially over. Massive, blinding red alarms overtook every single monitor in the corporate building. The entire accounting network, from the payroll servers to the merger liquidity accounts, went completely dark, locked down by an impenetrable federal quarantine seal. The financial freeze, however, was suddenly the least of Julian's problems. Because the hired hacker had explicitly tampered with data governed by national security, the anti-fraud protocol executed its final, most devastating directive. It automatically compiled a comprehensive digital evidence package, including Julian's network credentials, the unauthorized midnight entry logs, and the raw source code of the biometric forgery. The system then transmitted that pristine, undeniable package directly to the Cybercrime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Julian Vance had tried to play a clever corporate trick to cover up his own incompetence, and in doing so, he had just committed a highly documented federal felony. Thursday morning arrived with a suffocating, unbearable heaviness inside the OmniStream executive boardroom. The air was absolutely dead. The chief executive officer and 3 lead investors from the acquiring firm sat in a stunned, horrifying silence. They were all staring blankly at the massive projection screen at the front of the room. The financial deficit was no longer just a pending warning. It was a massive, bleeding hole in their daily liquidity report, effectively killing the multi-billion-dollar merger they had spent the last 2 years building. Julian Vance stood at the head of the long oak table, looking like a man standing on the gallows. His face was the color of wet ash, completely drained of the arrogant smirk he wore just a few days prior. He was sweating through his expensive tailored suit, desperately trying to spin his catastrophic failure into someone else's fault. "She is a technological extortionist," Julian pleaded, his voice thin, reedy, and cracking under the immense pressure of the room. "Harper Reynolds intentionally planted a malicious, hidden trap in our infrastructure. We need to take immediate, aggressive legal action. We will sue her, freeze all of her personal assets, and force her to return the stolen capital by the end of the week." He was lying, and every single executive in that room knew it, but they were too panicked and exhausted to interrupt his pathetic rambling. Then, without any warning or polite knock, the heavy wooden doors of the boardroom violently swung open. Julian turned quickly, a brief flash of hope in his eyes, fully expecting to see corporate security bringing me into the building for a forced negotiation. Instead, a team of grim-faced men and women wearing dark, immaculate suits marched into the room, flashing gold federal badges. They were top-tier legal representatives from the United States Department of Transportation, accompanied closely by heavily armed federal cybercrime inspectors. The lead inspector did not even bother to look at Julian. He walked directly to the chief executive officer and dropped a thick-bound digital forensic dossier onto the polished table. The sound echoed like a gunshot. "We have officially seized your primary corporate servers under federal authority," the inspector announced, his voice flat and completely devoid of any emotion. "We possess irrefutable, time-stamped digital evidence that an individual inside this building hired an unauthorized shadow contractor last night. That contractor attempted to falsify encrypted biometric credentials on a federal logistics database. Julian's mouth opened in shock, but his vocal cords completely failed him. The inspector finally turned his cold, unforgiving gaze toward the trembling vice president of operations. The $9,400,000 security compensation transferred to your former architect is entirely legal, governed by a contract this company willingly signed, the inspector stated firmly. However, attempting to forge federal security documents to cover up your own administrative mistake is a felony of the highest order. The chief executive officer slowly stood up from his leather chair. The look of pure, unadulterated fury radiating from his face was genuinely terrifying. He looked at Julian, the arrogant man who had just destroyed the company to stroke his own massive ego. "You are fired, Julian," the chief executive officer whispered, his voice trembling with a terrifying rage. "Effective right this exact second. Get out of my sight." Julian tried to stammer out an apology, but the federal inspectors calmly stepped forward, instructing him to turn around and place his hands behind his back. He was escorted out of the boardroom in complete disgrace, heading straight for a federal holding cell, miles away from the collapsing corporate empire. The morning air was crisp, beautiful, and completely serene. I was sitting at a quiet corner table in a small cafe overlooking the shimmering blue waters of Lake Michigan. Across from me sat Arthur, stirring his black tea with a deeply satisfied smirk on his weathered face. I opened the secure banking application on my phone one last time. I stared at the bold, beautiful numbers glowing brightly on the final screen. $9,400,000, clear, settled, and completely mine. I smiled, a genuine, deeply relaxed smile, and took a slow, comforting sip of my warm coffee. My phone suddenly buzzed on the table. It was an urgent email marked with the highest possible priority, sent directly from the OmniStream board of directors. I opened it and quickly skimmed the frantic, desperate paragraphs. The board was begging me to return. They were offering me an astronomical hourly rate as an independent consultant, promising me total creative control and absolute immunity if I would just come back and unlock their frozen systems. I looked at the desperate email for a brief second, then, with a single, effortless swipe of my finger, I sent the entire message straight to the spam folder. I closed my laptop with a soft, satisfying click. I thanked Arthur for his excellent company, stood up from the table, and walked out into the brilliant, golden sunshine, stepping forever into a life of absolute freedom. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. Where in the world are you tuning in from? Let me know in the comments below. As I mentioned earlier, if you found today's corporate revenge satisfying, please consider supporting us. You can join the Boss Revenge Stories Patreon channel to hear the absolute best, most detailed, exclusive true stories that we simply cannot publish on YouTube. Just scan the Patreon QR code right on your screen, or use the link provided in the description and the pinned comment. Your support means everything to us. Have a wonderful day.